This is a tape-recorded oral history interview with General Sam Phillips. The interviewer is Martin Collins. The date is February 23rd, 1988. This is tape 1, side 1. We like to begin our discussion with a sense of your very early background, where and when you were born, who your parents were.
I was born on February 19th, 1921 in Springerville, Arizona. Springerville was then and still is a forestry camp in the mountains of Arizona, some miles out from Flagstaff, which is better known. When I was born, my father was an electrician in a sawmill in Springerville. My father, Clarence Arthur Phillips, was born in Springfield, Illinois, and he was 27 years old when I was born. He was an electrician by trade, and was had great ambitions to be a Protestant minister. So he was a part-time minister as well as earning a living as an electrician. My mother, Mabel Gertrude Cochran, was her maiden name, was born in Nebraska. She also was 27 years old when I was born. I was the first child in their family. My family moved north from Arizona up into Colorado when I was only a few months old. My first real memories go back to when we lived in Denver, Colorado, and this would have been when I was 4 or 5 years old. My father still was an electrician, and that was, of course, how he earned his living. By then, he was with the Public Service Company of Colorado. He was a lineman.
That was one of the electrical utilities in Colorado?
Yes, it was the utility company that provided electric power, at least in Denver, and I'm sure through much of Colorado, and for that matter on up into Wyoming. So my family moved when I was only a few months old from Arizona to Colorado. First, I think, to Pueblo, and then on up to Denver, and a little later to Fort Collins, Colorado, and a little later to Brighton, Colorado. And then in about 1928, moved to Cheyenne, Wyoming, which is where I really grew up. I grew up then in Cheyenne, went to public school there.
Why was your family moving so much? Was that part of the requirement for alignment at that time?
Well, I don't know that it was a requirement for alignment, but I think it was a requirement in order to earn a living in those years to go where there was a need for that skill. And I really don't know the details of what the economics that caused that migration to occur, but it had to do with where there were jobs, and I'm sure, as he was with the same public service company for many years, that the opportunities were greater further north up that up that line, winding up in Cheyenne, Wyoming.
Did he continue as an electrician while in Cheyenne?
Yes, my father's living, he always earned a living as a lineman and electrician. And as a matter of fact, in 1945, was killed in an electrical accident on a pole as a lineman, that occurring while I was overseas in World War II. I mentioned that my father had great ambitions to be a Protestant minister. He had, at some point before I was born, attended Moody Bible Institute in Denver, and had reached a level of education and theology that qualified him for a license to preach, and so that during all of his adult life, then his avocation and what I think he really wanted to do was to be a minister. I can remember in my youth, in living in Wyoming, accompanying him on Sundays out to the prairie country, where he was their Sunday minister on Sunday out in the ranch areas in eastern Wyoming. My technical interests, I think, started with my father, who really was a very capable. And he was not an engineer. He was not educated as an engineer, but as an electrician, he certainly knew how electricity and electrical machines worked. And my early technical education largely started as a very young child with learning from my father about how electricity worked, and on from there, electrical machines, and
did he have some kind of workshop in the house?
I had a workshop in our house in the basement, and it was in that workshop that my father coached me and instructed me, and as I've mentioned.
Were you developing interest in things like radio? Was that where you were directing your interests, or were you looking at other aspects of
And my interests really were always toward radio and what has become the world of electronics and communications. At a very young age, I developed a very consuming interest in radio. And I can still remember when I was probably in about the fourth grade, which would have been probably 1930 or 31, when my father brought home our first radio. I remember it was an Atwater Kent radio, and I remember spending endless hours tuning around and listening to the various stations that we could receive out there. In that same period, I guess largely by self-instruction and with some coaching from my father, started to build radio equipment, starting with a typical crystal set. There too, I can remember spending hours, especially at night, tuning around and listening to various radio stations. I mentioned that I had a workshop in the basement of our house there in Cheyenne, and I did build a number of pieces of radio equipment of that era, radio receivers, and I also learned enough through largely self-instruction to get an amateur radio license, and then built transmitting equipment and set up a amateur radio station there in our house.
So were you instructing yourself? Were you looking at popular periodicals like Popular Mechanics, relying on the public library? How did that work?
It was, I can remember Popular Mechanics and Popular Science, both of which I read regularly as a young boy. Also, I should mention that my father's older brother, my Uncle Harry, lived in Boulder, Colorado. Not in Boulder. He lived in Brighton, Colorado, which is 25 or so miles north of Denver. And my uncle was also an electrician and also a lineman, as my father. But his interests many years earlier had developed along the line of radio technology. And he was one of the early amateurs that was licensed. And he was a builder of what in the 20s and 30s were advanced technology devices, largely through his interest in amateur radio. He built some of his own vacuum tubes, and he made what I'm sure were some of the very first very high frequency tubes, triodes, for use in the amateur 5-meter band, I remember. So I spent time with my uncle in the summer. At least in 2 summers, I spent time with him. I learned a lot from him about radios and designing and building them. And I think through him and acquiring an amateur radio license, I became a member of the ARRL, the American Radio Relay League, which goes back to the early part of this century in the amateur radio business. And they've been the publisher of radio handbooks since the early part of the century. So I used their handbook for a lot of that learning also.
Did your family encourage this interest? Was this something they wanted?
Yes, they did. They encouraged it. I know actively on the part of my father, and so yes, the answer is yes. It definitely was encouraged.
Did you have any other siblings?
Yes, I was the oldest of 6 children. I had 2 sisters and 3 brothers. Interestingly enough, the 3 brothers stayed in Cheyenne, Wyoming all their lives, and they still live out in that area. The brothers chose, I guess for their own reasons, to not complete a college education, and they well, they've been quite satisfied to follow various trade activities and stay in Wyoming. I think that brings to mind an important subject, though. I think starting in junior high school, which would have been there in those years, through the 8th grade, somewhere probably in the 8th grade, a person, a teacher at that time, he was a teacher in the manual arts, the shops of metal working and woodworking and so on, which I was always very interested in and as I recall, did well in. But the teacher took an interest in my development. It wasn't obvious to me at that time, but in retrospect certainly was. And he was a member of the Kiwanis Club, and on a few occasions would take me to the Kiwanis lunch and introduce me at least to that element of life, which was quite different than anything I was used to. Then in high school, I was not an enthusiastic student, and certainly not one that fell in the category of the intellectual or the high, the high achiever in grades. A person named Paul Albright, who was a teacher, took an interest and did, I can recall, quite a bit of personal counseling, counseling me to do better in school, among other things, and to get better grades. But in the end, he took the initiative to get a scholarship for me to the University of Wyoming, without which I probably wouldn't have gone to college. And I mention that because it has been a lesson to me all my life of the importance of the profound effect that individuals can have on other individuals. And by the simple act of those two teachers that I've mentioned taking a personal interest in me as an individual, and in the case of Albright, taking the initiative to help me get a simple scholarship to the university. Just
Albright's area of responsibility at the high school?
He was, I think, what today probably would be called a dean of boys, although didn't have that title. He had, I think, his specialty also was in the sciences and in the manual arts fields. But he was more at that time a counselor, a senior counselor, and well, to get a few more specifics, I went to public schools in Cheyenne, graduating from Cheyenne High School in the summer of 1938. I went then in the fall of 1938 to the University of Wyoming and enrolled as a freshman in electrical engineering, and graduated from the University of Wyoming in 1942 with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. The engineering school at the University of Wyoming in those years, the electrical engineering curriculum, was devoted entirely to electrical power. To my recollection, electronics as a field hadn't yet been identified. And I can remember I think it was late 1941 when a young professor was hired onto the staff of the electrical engineering school. The professor having come from, as I recall, Ohio, and he had been educated in some of the fundamentals of what later became electronics, and he gave lectures in energy levels of electrons and things that were very, very exciting to me, having spent all my education up to that point in the mundane, sort of boring elements of electrical machinery and power transmission and so on.
So this was one of your first introductions to basic physics in some sense, or advanced physics
Yes.
at this point?
Yes, very, very definitely. With apology for skipping around, I should go back to my upbringing there in Cheyenne. I've mentioned my interest in radio, and it was probably while I was in, say, the 9th grade that I walked one day from the high school up to the airport, which was a relatively short distance by modern standards, and walked into what was then the CAA, Civil Aeronautics Authority radio station, and introduced myself, and I said I just wanted to see their equipment and their station. Well, that led to an association that in some ways persisted right up to now. The operators in that little radio station kind of took me under their wing, it turned out, and I had a lot to do with my education and knowledge of radio and radio communications. Cheyenne, Wyoming in the 30s, and I guess even up into the 40s, was a hub or a center of transportation in the western part of the country.
Resuming our discussion after a brief pause.
I was saying that Cheyenne, Wyoming in the early part of this century was a hub of transportation. It was on the main line of the Union Pacific Railroad, and some significant fraction of the payroll in Cheyenne came from the Union Pacific Railroad. It was the east-west, north-south hub for air traffic in those years. And United Airlines had their main maintenance shops there on the airport in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And so Cheyenne was a hub point in the Federal Airways system at that time, and had the navigation aids of that period, which were the very low frequency radio range devices that are no longer used, at least in this country, and had regular broadcasts of airways weather for both the east-west airway through Cheyenne and for the north-south airway through Cheyenne. The north-south airway ran from Tucumcari, New Mexico to Billings, Montana, with Cheyenne being the main hub point for communications. And east-west, of course, the weather broadcasts used to go out at least to Nevada and to the east out through Nebraska. But Cheyenne also had a very high frequency CW, or continuous wave code, Morse code station that would gather the weather reports along those north-south and east-west airways. And that's where I really gained some of my proficiency in Morse code, was these radio operators, as I say, who kind of took me on as a kid.
Was this just kind of an informal thing where you hung around, or did they sort of bring you in and ask you to do little jobs?
Well, it started out as an informal thing with them taking an interest in me as a kid, who had a great interest. And I've forgotten just when it occurred, but somewhere along the way they gave me a job as the janitor for their station. And I think I earned something like $10 a week going in there, I guess probably about every day, and sweeping the place out, and on weekends waxing the floor and so on. So I, in some ways, earned my keep there. But there again, I guess is an example of how adults taking some interest in an individual can pretty profoundly influence their lives. I've mentioned that in the case of some teachers.
What was the influence there, the thing that you derived from that experience?
A lot of learning about airways, navigation aids, communications, electrical, radio communications. I remember I did a paper at the University of Wyoming on how the low-frequency range operated, which in terms of the curriculum of the University of Wyoming, which was entirely power, was, I suppose, was contributory and unique. But that was a very sophisticated radio device. Even today it would be, how the course lines are created in with radio using the generation of radio frequency signals and the modulating of those, and how directional patterns are established in the radiation of those energies to create the alternate A's and N's in the Morse code, which on the course lines become solid signals. That's just...
What's the significance of the A's and N's in that description?
Well, an A is a dot dash and an N is a dash dot. And if you impose or superimpose the A and the N in a proper way, the dots fill the spaces and you have a solid line. If you visualize imposing A's and N's in a way, dots and dashes, that you create a solid line. And in an oversimplified way, that's how the generation of radio signals and the transmission of those in a directional sense create the course lines, which were the solid signals. And if you were off the course line, you had in one direction an A signal and in the other direction an N signal, so you knew which quadrant you were in.
I see.
But as I say, that element of learning the opportunity for that came about by my walking into this CAA radio station, and the operators there were taking an interest, and over quite a number of years then, through high school and even on through college, I spent a lot of time in that radio station, both contributing in an informal or in a non-employee sense, and learning. That being on the edge of the airport then really introduced me to airplanes and to flying. And one of the radio operators there in the station himself had quite an interest in flying, and he was a part owner in an airplane, and so largely through his activities, I then wound up learning to fly, which is another brief story in itself. This was
during high school.
Yes, this was during high school. I've forgotten just what year it was, but it probably was 1938. As I say, I've forgotten just when this occurred, whether it was while I was still in high school or after I'd gone over to the university. The war in Europe, of course, was already starting to build up. So I guess it would have had to be after I went to the university, starting in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland and those eastern countries. So somewhere in the 39-40 period, a program was established called civilian pilot training. And under that program, individuals who qualified had the opportunity to enroll in a course of flying instruction. And so when that opportunity presented itself, I did enroll in the primary civilian pilot training there in Cheyenne. And through that program, had my initial flying training and got a private pilot's license. And I followed that primary course up over in Laramie at the university by enrolling in the advanced civilian pilot training program, which was offered there in Laramie. It was not really a part of the university curriculum, but it was available. And through that program, I acquired more advanced skills in flying. And through those two civilian pilot training programs, and then working around the airport to earn and being paid in flying time, by the time I graduated from college, I had probably the order of 300 hours of flying. And in the latter part of that, I was beginning to earn some of my flying time by installing intercom equipment in these open cockpit airplanes we were using, and sort of beginning the activities, if you will, of airplanes and communication.
If we could just go back for a second. What was the effect, if any, of the economic downturn, depression, on your family or on your school activities?
Profound. My family was really a poor family. The salary of my father with the public service company as a lineman was meager. It was adequate to provide the basics for a large family, which we were, a family of 6 children and 2 adults. But there was never anything left over. It was a poor existence. And of course that was much of that period was during the Depression. think probably to my own advantage, I was more or less on my own to earn any spending money, and to some extent even to contribute to the family income from a pretty young age. I think my own opinion is that was to the advantage of my development. But with jobs like the one I mentioned, being the janitor in the CAA radio station, which was really a pleasure because it gave me an opportunity to learn and be exposed to the people that I was associated with. But my summer jobs were also great learning experiences. I was an electrician's helper during the summer there in Cheyenne for an electrical company, Stevenson Electric, I remember the name, which company wired houses and commercial buildings. They were a construction business doing the wiring. And of course, I was I guess equipped to some extent because of the knowledge that I'd gained from my father. But I learned a lot during those summer jobs, and interestingly enough, over my life, I've probably rewired every house we've ever lived in, including this one.
Was this during the summers during your high school years or your college years?
Both. It was both. Pay was not very good in those years. I'm trying to remember just what I got paid. It wasn't more than about $10 a week during summer jobs. It wasn't very much. I guess, I should also mention that I think the last 2 summers of college, I worked in the electrical generating plant there in Cheyenne, Wyoming. That was the same company that my father worked for as a lineman. And so there too I learned a lot about power plants and industrial installations, and through hard labor of working on these big steam turbines and the steam piping systems and the boilers and the electrical distribution equipment in that power plant.
So you were getting a pretty basic grounding in the really practical aspects of electrical engineering, if you will.
Yes, very much so. And with the diversity of electrical power and radio and communications.
Well, as the end of your undergraduate tenure approached, the war had started. The international scene had been in turmoil for a couple of years. What were you in a position to be drafted? What was the situation there among the students who were eligible for the draft as the war started?
Well, to answer that question directly, there was not any feeling of pressure of the draft that I can remember among the student populace. It was almost the reverse. It was an enthusiastic willingness to and a strong desire to become involved. So, at least during the period that I was there, the revulsion over Pearl Harbor which occurred in December of 41. So therefore, it was right very near the time when I graduated in the spring of 1942. So the whole atmosphere was one of revulsion and the desire to be involved. Now, I'm sure later the attitudes changed, but at least while I was there, it was almost the reverse of any apprehension over and fear of the draft.
Yeah. I guess what I was getting at was the possibility, you'd invested almost 4 years in your education, that the possibility might arise that you might not get to complete it. I wonder whether that was a concern.
Well, it turned out that it was not, and it was largely the timing, because I say December of the Pearl Harbor occurred roughly 6 months from when I was scheduled to graduate. And for a variety of reasons, I and most of the other, at least the engineering seniors, were allowed or even encouraged to finish our work and really to satisfy the requirements for the degree in the spring, as opposed to going on through to June. But this prompts me that I should mention another strong line along my development. The Reserve Officer Training Program, ROTC, was big in Wyoming in those years, and that was a fact even well before any inklings of what became World War II came on the scene. The University of Wyoming was a land-grant college. It was in those years the only university in that state, which is a small state. And one of the requirements of land-grant colleges was to conduct an ROTC program. Now, I think that was universally a requirement, but it was certainly my understanding of the requirements there at the university. Now, I'll come back to the university, but going back to my high school days, the high school at Cheyenne had a very active ROTC program. And as I remember, it was mandatory for, say, freshmen in high school to take ROTC. I was attracted to ROTC and pursued it very vigorously. And so I was active in the ROTC program up through my graduation from high school, and had achieved one of the senior cadet officer positions there in the cadet corps at high school. And so I then became quite active in the ROTC program at the University of Wyoming. And at the university, I suppose probably in my third year as a junior, the professor of military science and tactics, he was an Army colonel, Malcolm E. Craig was his name, urged me to take a competitive examination for a regular commission. And although I'd had a strong interest in ROTC, by then I was really looking forward to competing and winning one of the jobs with one of the big electrical companies. Had ambitions to be an engineer with RCA or General Electric or Westinghouse, with my ambitions being in the largely the radio or radio-related fields. So I had a parallel interest at that point, and my interests in the ROTC were influenced to some extent by the exposure I'd had to the Civil Aeronautics Authority and the Federal Airways and to airplanes and flying, and to career opportunities that I could see in the as a military officer. So I had competing interests at that point. It was not difficult for Colonel Craig to talk me into taking the competitive exam. And somewhat, I guess to my surprise, I won whatever the competition was and was awarded a regular Army commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army, as compared with a reserve commission. So I had a regular commission with still, I think, a year to go in college. And they couldn't award the commission until I reached 21 years of age, which I reached in February of '42. And then, of course, I graduated in the spring of '42. So, with Pearl Harbor occurring, there was never any doubt about what I was going to do when I left the university. It was to go into the Army and to go in under the commission that I had